was exciting. That. Hey. Morning.
Sorry.
We were a little delayed because the camera wasn't working, so we're just now going to start. It's a perfect time.
Not perfect.
Actually, we're recording right now. So, all right. So this is a fun chapter, right? Most of the sweat gland, or just the adnexal tumors, rather, are a little bit annoying at first. They do become, in a weird way, maybe just to me, a little bit fun, mainly because they can be so recognizable. So when you're on a board exam or a test and you see a trichoadenoma, you're like, oh, trichoadenoma, move on. I mean, it's super easy versus like trying to delineate some weird other thing. But this particular chapter is somewhat fraught with not necessarily controversy, but confusion, because of ecrine versus apocrine differentiation, and it's very confusing and annoying. Some of these entities have the word ecrine in them, but they're actually apocrine. Now we know that, in terms of differentiation, and so you have to kind of take all that with a grain of salt. It's like a lot of other things in medicine, particularly dermatology. The name, like impetigo herpetiformis, doesn't necessarily really convey what you're actually diagnosing. So. We'll go through these and try to make as much sense of it as possible. So this first one is a aggressive digital papillary carcinoma, and actually the aggressive term has been somewhat removed from that, mainly because there used to be a digital papillary adenoma and then a digital papillary adenocarcinoma, but really they're all bad, and so we just kind of got rid of the benign version and we just call them all adenocarcinomas now. And in terms of trying to lump things versus splitting things, this is very similar to HPAP in a sense, but on the finger. And so we'll get to HPAP, or hidradenocarcinoma papilliferum, later, but if you see something that looks kind of like HPAP and it's on the nipple, then that's a nipple adenoma, or erosive adenomatosis of the nipple, which is something that you will actually see on boards and whatnot. And if you see it on the finger, then it's digital papillary carcinoma, and they have some similarities. Now, this is kind of a deeper tumor. You can see there's not really even any skin anywhere, and the slide itself said digital mass. So you kind of would need that history, otherwise this could have come from anywhere, and how do you really narrow that down? There are some features in here that would help to start to point you towards it being ecrine in origin, and that being, when you get in a little bit closer, here's where you start to see that kind of almost HPAP appearance. And so again, we'll get to HPAP, but that's that kind of maze-like architecture of an ecrine neoplasm. Now, with the digital papillary carcinoma, there's usually more cystic spaces. It's usually more of a dense, solid tumor, and then the cystic spaces. But when you get in closer, here's where you can see like apocrine, in this instance, apocrine differentiation, and kind of things that are reminiscent of almost sweat gland proliferation in here, and so it almost has kind of a maze-like architecture. I know it's hard to really extrapolate that at this point, but that's essentially the line of thinking when it comes to digital papillary carcinoma. Now, in this instance, this one looks really bad. They don't always look bad, but there are tons of mitoses in here, and there's probably a little bit of pleomorphism, and just the cells look a little bit atypical. But these mitoses, and so all those things put together, on the finger, and it has kind of that sweat gland architecture. Almost looks maze-like in some areas. You'd be thinking, oh, this is digital papillary adenocarcinoma of the finger. So that's what that was. Although I guess you wouldn't say of the finger if you said digital. That would be very repetitive. Okay, so this second one is a clear cell syringoma. And later when I get to syringomas or some of the other Paisley-Tie differential, I'll kind of go through, like we did with the pilar trichoepithelioma chapter, of some ways to differentiate them. But in short, this is a very small, well-circumscribed proliferation of little, what looks to be sweat glands. Now, because it's clear cell, from scan, it just looks like a bunch of cells, or almost like a bunch of just infiltrate. It's hard to tell that they're actual ducts. I mean, obviously there's some big ones here, but it can be hard to distinguish. But once you know that there's ducts in here, you say, well, it's a very, very small proliferation. There's a little bit of a sclerotic stroma, it's a little redder and thicker and more dense collagen in between. And then hopefully from the history, you would say, oh, it's kind of heavily pigmented skin, so maybe someone from darker skin type, and maybe it came off of the periorbital location. Like, oh, all those things going together really push me towards syringoma. And in this case, there is clear cell change, which can happen to a lot of different tumors, but certainly can happen to syringomas. And so you can see that just clear cells as part of the proliferation. And these are actual sweat ducts, meaning that this is not keratinaceous debris. This is like sweat schmoo that's in here. Very technical term. There is some infiltrate as well, but it's a sweat gland proliferation, very well circumscribed on heavily pigmented skin. And so this would go most with syringoma. And remember, syringomas are most common in Asians and in darker skin types. It's also very common in Down syndrome. And then the clear cell variant, we like to say, is highly associated with diabetes. Doesn't mean they have to have that, but those are kind of the clinical things that go with it. And of course, that's on the Paisley-Tie differential, which, like I said, I'll go through here in a minute. Now that is in contrast to this. This is a ginormous tumor, and this is a microcystic adnexal carcinoma. Let me just make sure, yeah. And so I'll go ahead and kind of get into the Paisley-Tie now. So remember that the Paisley-Tie differential, there's my suit defines my body, and so the M is for MAC. The suit stands for syringoma. Defines is desmoplastic trichoepithelioma, and then my body is morphiiform basal cell. And so all those things can look very, very similar. And there's just some subtle clues sometimes to help point you in one direction or the other. Sometimes it's still a differential. In fact, one of the answers on this list is Paisley-Tie differential, and it's not actually a diagnosis. But there are some things that can lead you point you in the right direction. So again, if it's a very small, well-circumscribed, almost exclusively or only exclusively ducts, sweat ducts, little red sclerotic stroma, that would point you towards a syringoma. Whereas if you get this huge, massive proliferation, that kind of points you towards something not so nice. And so is this a morphiiform basal cell? Is this a microcystic adnexal carcinoma? It makes syringoma and desmoplastic trichoepithelioma much less likely. And then some of the things that point you towards microcystic adnexal carcinoma here is there's a biphasic tumor. So up top, there's actually what appears to be almost like little keratin forming little cysts, almost like a trichoepithelioma. And some of these are sweat ducts as well. So there's little syringomatous proliferations, but it's kind of mixed. Whereas down here, it's kind of all really nothing but the sweat neoplasm. And then it's this broad, huge tumor, deeply infiltrating with lymphoid aggregates. Those lymphoid aggregates are key. Those are really what kind of help you point towards it being something bad that goes with various things in dermatology. And if you searched, which I don't really have the time per se to search, but if you searched, you would probably find some perineural invasion. And of course, that's never good, and that also helps push you towards it being something bad. So these are all, now you can see up close why it might be hard to distinguish from a morphiform basal cell. And kind of getting back up more to the superficial portion, some of these areas, like that's probably keratin in there. It can be hard to distinguish sometimes, whereas this is more that amorphous schmoo that's probably actual sweat. So some of these you'd have to stain probably for some of them unless it's very obvious. Sometimes it's very obvious, like horn cysts, but a lot of times it can be hard to distinguish. Now you can see why if all you got was a very superficial biopsy, that can be very hard to tell, is this just a syringoma or does it go way deeper? And so that can be very important. So getting back real quick to some other clues, for desmoplastic trichoepithelioma, it should also be pretty small, well circumscribed. Hopefully you have a little dell in the center of it. And then it's, generally speaking, mostly horn cysts and then maybe some calcifications. You don't really see ducts. That shouldn't really be part of it. And morphiform basal cell, that can kind of have all three of the things. So we've been talking about horn cysts, ducts, and the calcifications. So that doesn't necessarily help you. And same thing with the MAC. But with the MAC, you usually have both the kind of sweat gland proliferation and the pilar component. So that's a microcystic adnexal carcinoma. Okay, so this one is a mixed tumor, and this is the small tubular type. And this one is, the slide's a little bit faded, but we're in the skin, so we know that. We see skin up top. And then we see this sort of, from scan, we see this sort of bluish mass here in the deeper dermis, and it almost looks like cartilage. And you can certainly just get cutaneous deposits of cartilage, various things that can do that. There's chondromas and whatnot. But in this case, it is also essentially a biphasic tumor. What makes this a mixed tumor is that you have a kind of a sudiferous or sweat gland proliferation, but then you also have a mesenchymal component, and that mesenchymal component is cartilage or even bone or fibrous components. And so since you have both of those things, that's why it's a mixed tumor. And the other name for this is chondroid syringoma. And so you can see all those little itty-bitty small, very reminiscent of eccrine gland, syringomatous component, but then of course the obvious bluish chondroid component, stroma essentially. And so that's what makes this a mixed tumor. And these can be malignant. It's pretty rare, but it's certainly possible. And so there's the two types. There's small tubular, and then there's branching alveolar. And that's that. So mixed tumor. There are other things, too, that can give you sort of bluish appearance. If you saw from scan these big nodular kind of bluish whorls, that could be a adult myofibroma, which we'll get to in the muscle chapter way down the road. So there's other things that can give you that bluish hue, but when you get up close and it has that almost cartilage appearance, and then of course the syringomatous component, then that clues you in. So this is the branching alveolar type of the chondroid syringoma or mixed tumor. And once again, from scan, you kind of see that sort of bluish appearance, and it looks like cartilage. But then you've got these sort of branching alveolar space-looking, syringomatous proliferation. And generally speaking, it's still kind of well-defined. There's no areas of marked necrosis or atypia, so it doesn't look like it's gone bad or anything, so it's just a branching alveolar type of mixed tumor. So I won't belabor that. There's 5. So 6. So this is a just classic run-of-the-mill syringoma. So once again, you can see that hopefully, it has, if it's just classic like this, you can say, oh, it's very, very small, very, very well circumscribed, very kind of thin overlying epidermis because it's probably from eyelid or periorbital skin, kind of a dense red sclerotic stroma. You can really see that stroma here. And then when you look at the the little ducts and the proliferation, it's really just ducts. You don't see horn cysts, you don't see calcifications, you don't see lymphoid aggregates. Of course, it is just kind of a superficial biopsy, but you don't really see any of those other things that would point you in any of the other directions, and so this really just becomes a syringoma. And so once again, getting close, you see that kind of brighter eosinophilic lining there of what looks to be pretty good for a duct, and then within you get this kind of amorphous shmoo. So that's not keratin flakes, or it's not like a horn cyst. So these are actual little ducts that are forming. So syringoma. Okay, so now they're the fun things. So this one is a cylindroma, although as I think in here, there's one of the answers is sort of a hybrid, meaning that you can have spiroadenomas that have components that look very much like cylindroma and vice versa. But this is classic cylindroma, so you get these jigsaw puzzle formation of this sort of dermal proliferation. These differentiate toward the secretory component of the eccrine gland, and there are some kind of clinical things to remember. Cylindromas are usually with more familial Brooks-Spiegler type or multiple familial trichoepitheliomas. So it's usually more syndromic, whereas spiroadenomas are more sporadic. And even in this cylindroma, you can see these sort of little hyaline droplets, and you get very dense hyalinized basement membrane here, but then even this sort of hyaline deposition within that is sort of what clues you into a spiroadenoma when you have a big, huge proliferation, those little hyaline droplets, but of course you can get that with this as well. And then you do see little duct formations, so little tiny ducts scattered throughout. But it's really that from scan, that jigsaw puzzle that just kind of gives it away. Don't forget, Brooks-Spiegler, you also get the trichoepitheliomas and spiroadenomas and cylindromas. And for spiroadenomas, I'll wait till we get to that one. So this classic jigsaw puzzle architecture is great for a cylindroma. Those are fun ones to get because they're so easy. Okay, so this one is syringocystadenoma papillariform, or SPAP for short. And sometimes they're a little bit more better developed. This one is still enough to kind of get to the answer, because you get these fjords and fronds, these little sort of seemingly intraluminal papillations. And it appears that it's something you can almost slide into, and it's very superficial. It's probably on the scalp. And so there's a lot of ways to use I think you mentioned that the S, and all these things start with S and different letters and things, and they seem to all be very similar. With something like SPAP, when you're comparing it to HPAP, early on we were trying to remember which goes where. SPAP, you can use that S to your advantage, so it's usually on the scalp. It's usually very cellular. It has lots of plasma cells in it. And then there are, let's see, look at the plasma cells. So within these little proliferations, there's tons of plasma cells in here. So you can see. And then the other S thing is that they open to the surface. You can slide right into it. There's a lot of ways to use the S. You can see in here all these little plasma cells. And for the first years, just to kind of get in a little closer real quick, this is always a great thing to use for an example of plasma cells. Okay, it's a little bit hazy, but these have the clock face nuclei, and they have that little perinuclear halo of Hopf. It's kind of hard to see actually, this a little bit too too close. But so tons of plasma cells. Those are always good to recognize. So anyways, this is SPAP. When you compare that to HPAP, it's usually in hidden locations, so vulva and whatnot, breast. If it's on the nipple, of course, then that's when it becomes erosive adenomatosis of the nipple, or nipple adenoma. Okay. So this one is the spiroadenoma. And so similar to that cylindroma, you get the little hyaline droplet formation. And that's kind of what clues you in here, because this is otherwise just this really big kind of bluish nodule or blue ball in the dermis. And once you get in closer, though, you can start to see all those little hyaline droplets. And if you get in really close, you'll see actual little duct formation as well. And here you can use the S in your favor as well. So when you're comparing cylindroma versus spiroadenoma, that S reminds you that it's usually on the scalp. They're sporadic versus being familial, so that's S. They're usually very cellular, meaning that they're chock full of lymphocytes scattered throughout the entire lesion. And they're usually sensitive, meaning they're tender. They're part of the tender tumor differential. And those are pretty much all the S's there. But you can see scattered throughout this whole lesion are tons and tons of lymphocytes. That's pretty characteristic for this tumor. And then again, all those little hyaline droplets. So that is a spiroadenoma. And again, you might see in some area, like maybe even over here, this almost looks like a couple little jigsaw puzzles together. See, certainly some overlap. So that's a spiroadenoma. Okay, now this one is HPAP, or hidradenoma papillariform. And this is where the naming can get kind of annoying, because is this even related at all to hidradenomas? Well, no, not at all. It's just sort of how it was named. But this one, you can really make out that kind of maze-like architecture. So you could imagine it being like a spherical maze, and you're kind of cutting through it. And so there's all these little crypts and things to walk through, if your imagination can go that far. It is in the skin, and it's just a very well circumscribed lesion. And again, these are usually in hidden locations. So maybe in the history you'd say, "Oh, it's from vulva or something, or the axilla, somewhere like that." And these, again, if you see this on the nipple, which is not usually difficult at all for the pathologist, but for dermatologists, sometimes we don't get used to seeing a whole lot of breast skin. But if you saw more of a papillomatous, like nipple-like skin appearance up here, and then down deep here, you actually saw ducts and apical glands and things. And then you'd be like, oh, it's on the nipple. I don't want to just call it HPAP. It's actually a nipple adenoma, erosive adenomatosis of the nipple, something of that nature. So, unlike with SPAP, this does not really have all those plasma cells and things. It may still have occasional plasma cells just based on the location of where it usually arises, it's one of those things where is it eccrine, is it apocrine? I will say that most things nowadays in the sweat gland neoplasm, they're kind of realizing are largely apocrine, even though we thought they were eccrine. Here you can actually see some apocrine snouting or decapitation secretion, so that helps a little bit. It ultimately doesn't really matter that much, but that's HPAP. Okay, that was number 10. It's 11. So this one, just make sure, yeah. So this one that they put in there kind of to compare with a mixed tumor or chondroid syringoma. And this is just a really deep nodule that's still in the skin, and from scan it's very bluish cartilaginous, but you don't really see as well a true tubular kind of almost syringomatous or eccrine gland proliferation within. You don't see that branching alveolar component. And so this one is not technically in the book. This is a solitary cutaneous chondroma. Yeah. So, but this is just, it's in there to be a really good example of cartilage. And, we see cartilage from time to time, whether it's, looking at CNH on the ear and you see a little bit of cartilage underneath and that helps clue you in, or maybe some other things. These cells here are just the little chondrocytes, I think they're called, and they're in like the little lacunae, kind of reminiscent of bone, and maybe eventually down the road this kind of ossifies. So this is really just to give you some comparison to look at more of a cutaneous cartilaginous proliferation thing. So solitary cutaneous chondroma. All right, so now into the fun acrosporoma group. So this one, you see the skin up here. So let me just briefly mention that this, I kind of talked about at the beginning, there is some frustration when it comes to some of the naming and the grouping of the neoplasms in this chapter. It is good, I think, to look at a lot of these as the acrosporoma group. But then you've got poromas, you've got hydradenomas, what does all that stuff mean? Ultimately, they are very, very much related, if not the exact same things. It's just sort of how the pattern looks. And so getting to the best name is based on the overall pattern and sometimes the location and whatnot. So in brief, if you just have more clonal proliferations in the epidermis, that's a hydroacanthoma simplex. Whereas if you have this very well-defined proliferation kind of pouring off the epidermis with a little coloritive scale on an acral location like the foot, that's a poroma. It's kind of pouring off the epidermis. Then you get into the hydradenomas, and there's other hydradenomas, and if you have this big, large, nodular appearing hydranoma coming off the epidermis, kind of going deeper than a poroma, not on the foot, that's a nodular hydradenoma. Those nodular hydradenomas can have cystic change, like this one. If it's very large, lots of cystic change, you can call it a solid and cystic hydradenoma. If all you see are what looks pretty classic for hydradenoma, poroid-looking cells, but they're all within the dermis, and there's just these little round kind of tumors in the dermis, it's a dermal duct tumor. So they're all really kind of the same things. It's just sort of the overall pattern and how you get to that naming. Very frustrating. I'm just the messenger, don't hate me. So this one, I believe the answer actually calls it okay, so this one they called a hybrid acrosporoma. And that's because, and that's why the naming pattern is so frustrating, because a lot of times within one tumor you're going to get multiple different patterns. So maybe up here somewhere you can kind of pretend like, oh, that's kind of like a nodular hydranoma pattern, or maybe if it was like just like here, that would be a nodular hydranoma, but here you've got these obvious kind of cystic components of solid and cystic hydranoma, whereas if it's a different cut of this, you might just get these and maybe be a dermal duct tumor. So it can be very very confusing. The poroid cells themselves, that's kind of the most important thing, is just being able to look at something and say, oh, this is in that sort of poroid category. That's something that takes time, but even from scan, it's almost like you can see the nuclei. They're so well defined and they're so evenly spaced. So what I like to say is that they're very just sort of evenly spaced and monotonous. And so when you get in a little bit closer, it's not like they're dirty, they're not pleomorphic. They're just these monotonous cells, almost in a sense akin to glomus tumor, how they're just sort of these little monotonous little nuclei. They're all seem to be evenly spaced. They have very well-defined kind of rounded or cuboidal nuclei. And so this is just the poroid appearance, or hydranoma cell appearance. And it takes some time, again, just to see these over and over again. But once you start to really get that look, you're like, oh, this is kind of in that poroid box, and it's not a basal cell or a squamous cell or something else. And it can be difficult sometimes. That's where you rely on staining and whatnot. But these are pretty good for those poroid cells. The other thing that can be helpful is actually seeing true ducts, whether it's little intraluminal ducts, and you can kind of see them here. They're pretty small, but that's what helps you in the clonal intraepidermal proliferation differential, is when you see these little itty-bitty small ducts, that helps you say, oh, it's hydroacanthoma simplex and not clonal SK or clonal bones or something like that. So enough on that. It's frustrating, I know. this one is just another mixed tumor, and this is kind of more the branching alveolar type. And the reason why this is a good comparison is because you still get in some still a dermal, you see skin up there, dermal proliferation, and you still get this sort of bluish appearance in some areas. And so you say, oh, that almost looks like kind of mixed tumor, and you got this really deep blue, branching alveolar syringomatous pattern with ducts within. So, oh man, this is probably just a mixed tumor, but why is all this fat in here? Well, remember, it's called a mixed tumor because you have the syringomatous component, and then you have the mesenchymal component, which can be cartilage, fibrous, fat, or all the above. So you don't necessarily have to have an entire thing chock full of that cartilaginous stuff. It's kind of a mixed bag. No pun intended. 14. I'm going to go a little faster because there's some repeats here. So this one is also a little bit of a hybrid. Let's see exactly what this one is called. This one, just the answer is hidradenoma. And so, I would agree, like if you just saw this and it's not on the foot and it doesn't look like it's got a Colorado scale or anything, that would be good for a nodular hidradenoma. Whereas, this one over here, kind of a little bit more like a solid and cystic hidradenoma. So it really depends on where you're looking and how it's cut. And if all you got was this one thing here, you'd probably still call it solid and cystic hidradenoma versus dermal duct tumors, usually smaller proliferations, but I think it's not wrong to just say it's hidradenoma. Okay, so this is the one that I told you the answer is Paisley tie differential, and that's because it is not necessarily as clear cut as you would want it to be. So certainly these are little Paisley tie tadpole-looking cells. It appears that they are true ducts. You don't see the keratinaceous debris or horn cyst. What's inside this is these little ducts are more the more sweat gland shmoo. But it is pretty broad. So unlike in its unpigmented skin, you're like, oh, maybe it's just a syringoma. But you'd want it to be this like small little proliferation, really dense red sclerotic stroma, which you don't necessarily see here. And so this could be any of those things. Now it's not super deep. You don't have lymphoid aggregate, so it's probably not a MAC. But you'd have to kind of go through that differential, which is why this one the answer is really just differential. Use all your clues to get to the bottom of that one. Okay, so this one, the last controversial entity is tubular apical adenoma versus papillary eccrine adenoma. And I won't belabor this because we're running out of time, but papillary eccrine adenoma that has eccrine in the name, so it really should be eccrine, right? Versus tubular apical adenoma really should be apocrine, whereas in fact both are maybe apocrine. It's hard to say. Now things are kind of changing a little bit. It's more the pattern that you see. There are some clinical differences. So this is listed as a tubular apocrine adenoma. This is number 16. But you can see, even within some of these smaller proliferations, there's some papillations, little fronding almost, and that kind of goes more with papillary eccrine adenoma. And it almost looks like it's acral, which is important. I'll mention that here in a second. But what you largely have are these huge kind of tubular proliferations, almost reminiscent of a trichoadenoma, except these are sweat gland proliferations. This is not keratin flakes and horn cyst-looking material within. This is sweat, so that makes it a tubular apocrine adenoma. But just remember that you can get some overlap. Now what you would hope to see in here is actual apocrine differentiation, and maybe down in some of these areas you can see some apocrine snouting, but it's not necessarily easy to find. So clinically, papillary eccrine adenoma is typically in African American children on their hands and feet, whereas tubular apical adenoma can kind of be anywhere. But so there are some subtle clinical differences, but there's a lot of overlap. This is a mucinous carcinoma. It's a great example of it. This is blue islands in a sea of snot. We just had one of these the other day. I think, was it you that you bought? Yeah.
Yep.
And wasn't even expecting it because they can look like a lot of random weird things. And they certainly are primary in the skin on the eyelid and the head and neck area, but they're certainly metastasized lesions as well from internal breast and GI cancer. They're very, very difficult to distinguish, even with lots of advanced staining and whatnot. P63 is something that we often use for different things, and if it's positive, we say, oh, that's suggestive of primary cutaneous origin. If it's negative, we say, oh, that's probably from systemic. That doesn't work for mucinous carcinoma, unfortunately. Primary lesions can still be P63 negative. So that one's very hard to distinguish. You basically have to do a search for any internal metastases, although, per the textbook, generally speaking, if someone has metastatic mucinous carcinoma, they usually have very advanced disease, and you already know that they've got bad breast cancer and other things. This is adenoid cystic carcinoma. This is another one that can actually be found on internal things, particularly like protogland neoplasms and whatnot, but it also can just be primary to the skin. This is a very unique pattern, has this sort of cribriform adenoid pattern with this very bluish sort of mucin here within. And so really good for adenoid cystic carcinoma. Usually the pattern here is enough to kind of give it away. And in terms of thinking of other things, well, trichoepitheliomas can sometimes have sort of a Swiss cheese pattern, but they shouldn't be filled with all this mucin. And so there are some things you may have to differentiate it from, but usually has a pretty easy pattern. Okay, so 19. This one is a mixed tumor gone bad, and it can be hard to determine that. It's certainly a deeper proliferation, and it just has this central zone of horrible, nasty necrosis. And since we're running short on time, I'm not going to go deep and do like a mitosis hunt, but I will tell you that there's really not much in there, and that's another reason why I'm not going to do the hunt. So you can't necessarily rely on tons of mitoses or even atypia and things of that nature. It can be very difficult, but you should see some necrosis, and maybe it's not as well defined. Maybe hopefully in a perfect world you get like classic mixed tumor that looks benign on one side and then an obvious horrible change on another side. Almost like a hidradenocarcinoma or porocarcinoma, things of that nature. Okay. So this is kind of getting into one of the last entities. So this one is, this is another mixed tumor branching alveolar type. And this one is a little bit harder because it's so pink. The slide is lost some of that bluish hue. And so since we've done this multiple times, I'll just kind of quickly past this one. But this area would have normally in a fresh cut slide, hopefully, been a much more bluish, kind of classic cartilaginous appearance, and then you get the branching alveolar pattern here. So without that blueness, it can be a little bit challenging. But those fine interlacing strands, almost reminiscent of syringofibroadenomatosis, which we'll get to here in a second. So this is a poroma. And this hopefully came off of someone's lateral foot or something, and had more of a classic history. Very well defined. Usually there's a kind of a collarette around it, almost like a pyogenic granuloma, and they can look clinically like pyogenic granulomas or amelanomas. But it just sort of has that monotonous poroid appearance. And when you get in a little closer, all those cells are just very nice, cuboidal, evenly spaced, all kind of lined up. And even from this distance, you can see little tiny duct formation that really kind of helps clue you in as well. So those little ducts there. Little ducts. Okay. Almost done. Okay. This is a hydrocystoma. This is usually on the eyelid, or actually kind of periorbital location. Very, very common. We see them not infrequently. Very thin. They're usually been popped basically, so it's just this thin, 2-layer thick cyst that's on thin kind of eyelid skin. If you see more papillary fronding within this, then there's a different term that we like to use called apocrine cystadenoma. And then it is important for you guys to at least vaguely know that there are some things around the eyelid that can kind of start out sort of looking like this, but if it looks like, oh, this is maybe just a apricot cystadenoma because it's a hydrocystoma, but it has some papillary fronding. But then it looks bad, and there's mucin and whatnot. There's other things out there like endocrine mucin-producing sweat gland carcinoma, and that can sometimes even progress on to become mucinous carcinoma and stuff. So there's other bad things out there, but for hydrocystoma, usually very, very classic, small little lesion, and those can be associated with different syndromes. I think Shop-Schultz-Prasad syndrome, it can be with that and other stuff. So this one is in the poroid category, and they called this one a dermal duct tumor, which, again, you see a lot of overlap, and there's a lot of, usually you'll see multiple patterns within one lesion, but this here is really good for dermal duct tumor. It's almost like having the clonal hydroacanthoma simplex, but in the dermis, because it's like these usually smaller, almost clonal little balls in the dermis. Now this one also has some cystic area. It sort of connects to the epidermis, and so there's some overlap in the different patterns. But that's what that one is. 24. So this slide is not the best, but this is syringofibroadenomatosis. There's two forms. There is the true syringofibroadenoma of Mascaro. That one is, if you have multiple lesions that come back with that result, then it could be part of Clausen syndrome, which is hydrotic ectodermal dysplasia, or Shop-Schultz-Prasad syndrome. So it can be associated with syndromes. Also, we'll probably ask that. But by and large, the majority are reactive. So reactive syringofibroadenomatosis, sort of in a sense similar to syringometaplasia, which you can get above scars and things. But in other words, it's more of a reactive process. And thinking of things that look similar, I mean, in a certain sense, you could almost be like, oh, is this Pincus tumor? But it's not, because you don't really have the thin, pink strands and blue buds. It's more just these thin strands kind of coming off the epidermis, usually very vertically oriented. So, and you might even see little ducts here and there occasionally. Okay. So this one is a clear cell hydranoma, and the slide's a little bit faded. I'll just kind of zoom in to some of the, we've gone over hydranomas now ad nauseum, but there is, they can have clear cell change, all the different types can, and you can see how there's some clear cells within here that can sometimes make it a little more challenging, but it's very, very common. And this last one is that syringo, and this one I think, is actually syringofibroadenoma Mascaro. So supposedly this is more the syndromic type. Very characteristic appearance coming off the epidermis there. All those thin kind of interlacing strands, but you don't see blue buds coming off, and it's not really. There's ways certainly to distinguish it from Pincus tumor. So that's it.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. On that one, there was a lot of slides.